Hello, my name is Xander and welcome back to another tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to introduce Nginx Cache. Before I do that, just to remind you that this is part of a playlist if you haven't found it already. If you go to the main channel and go to playlists, there's a playlist here called Nginx Mastery. So there's around about 4 tutorials at the moment. So this is the 5th tutorial in this series. In the previous tutorial, we created a setup with Docker containers, which included a DNS server and an Nginx proxy server or reverse proxy server. How this worked is that the user types into their browser a domain name, then we basically just replicate what happens online utilizing a local DNS server. So we resolve the domain name's IP address, and then we can use that IP address to then send a request to the Nginx server. The Nginx server was set up as a reverse proxy server, so it would forward that request over to the back end here, where GUnicorn would intercept that request and then be able to translate it into something that Django can manage and handle, and then Django can then return the web page that's been requested. Of course, the reality here might be that Django is also connected to some sort of file server and database. So in this type of scenario, we may want to cache both static and dynamic content from our proxied web application servers to speed the delivery of data to clients and also to reduce the loads on our servers. So let's imagine we had 100,000 users trying to access the same web page on our Django server. It doesn't seem the best use of resources to actually process those 100,000 users individually. We'd have to do 100,000 same things on the back end here, and that would take up RAM, that would take up CPU time, and that would cost us money. So let's just process the first request for that individual page and save the results in cache over here on our Nginx server instance. When the cache is enabled, Nginx saves the responses from our backend servers in our cache on disk. Now, we don't have to store it in disk in Nginx. We can have all different types of setups. But in this scenario, we go for the default and we're just going to store the requests over in our cache here on disk. So now we have that first user's request for our web resource and it's saved in cache. The other 999,000 requests can now be served directly from cache. And you can see straight away that means that we don't have to send a signal over here. We don't need to process it by our Django servers, etc. So here we're reducing the amount of load we're putting on our servers. We're saving money potentially, and also we're moving the data closer to the client. And that means that potentially we can serve our cache data a lot quicker than having to go ahead and send a signal over to our proxy servers here and having to then process all those requests individually. So simply put, what we now have is the user makes a request, and then instead of sending a signal across over here to our servers, we simply just serve the request directly from, if I can do this, directly from our cache here. There we go. So it just gets served directly from our cache. So hopefully that gives you a better idea of what it is we're doing in this tutorial. I'm going to introduce the idea of Nginx Cache on our reverse proxy server. We're going to configure and manage the cache path. That's the first step. It's a mandatory step. And then we go through some of the different configuration options for both managing single and multiple endpoints so that we can have different cache settings on different directories or endpoints. And then we go ahead and talk maybe a little bit about some of the different Nginx processes, so we get an idea of what's happening behind the scenes, how Nginx manages the cache process, and then potentially then move into some other aspects, for example, cache locking. This is meant to be an introductory guide, so we won't go into too much detail, but I want this to be a baseline introduction so that we can move into deeper content later on in this tutorial series. There is quite a following now, so I just wanted to thank all the channel members that are currently subscribed either to Patreon or the YouTube channel membership. If you are thinking about supporting our channel further, then have a look at the YouTube channel membership for our channel, or potentially follow us on Patreon. All those links can obviously be found from the main channel page. If you are following this tutorial along step by step, all the code is as a link in the video description, which will take you to the Nginx Mastery series repository. So the previous tutorial was part 4, so we are going to start from part 4, use that code, so go ahead and download that. We are using Visual Studio Code here in this tutorial, so by all means utilize that too to follow it along. Now, in addition to that, we are using Docker containers to simulate all of these servers. So again, if you are going to follow along, you're also going to need Docker Desktop installed. Once you downloaded the code, you'll find there is a Docker Compose file as well as many other folders simulating the different services that we set up here in Docker containers. Now, one thing that is missing is the environment variables. We are using environment variables here to populate some of the sensitive data that Django requires. So that will be missing when you download the repository. So just go ahead and you'll just need to make a new folder. So create a new folder called .env. And then inside of here, we create a new file called dev.env. There are 3 settings here. A secret key, you can just make this up. You don't have to type all that in. You can just use whatever. Allow local hosts, or loud host, sorry, in our Django setting, and then debug equals 1. So those are the 3 settings that you could set up. You don't need debug 1 in actual fact, because it just defaults to 0. So you set up some allowed hosts, and that's the configuration setup. So everything is now ready. Everything in this code should work okay. So let's just go straight to configuring our cache. So like I said previously, everything about this code has been discussed in previous tutorials. So if you are interested in going back and finding out exactly what this setup is, have a look at the previous tutorials and I'll take you through that step by step. So our cache setup, like all the Nginx configuration, will be done within our Nginx confd folder here and utilizing the default file, the default config file. Now remember, this is a file that's copied across and mirrored across to our container when we run Nginx. And we're just using it here just for convenience so that we can configure it in Visual Studio Code. So I've just deleted that. We don't need that for now. So this is our setup at the moment. We have a proxy setup here where we pass all the data over to our web server, which is the Django and GUnicorn setup. So what we're going to do here then is set up cache. So the first thing to do when we want to enable caching of responses is we need to include the proxy cache path directive. This in essence is basically just telling Nginx where to store the cache data. So that's the first thing that we need to do. So let's just put that up the top here. So like I said, the proxy proxy cache path. So we're just going to define that. Then there's a few different parameters here. Now the default path tends to be var cache and then Nginx. So what is that? What does this describe here? Now, remember, we're going to spin up a container which essentially has, let's just say it has a Linux operating system on it. So when we build our container, that's running a container inside, say, like an operating system, as well as Nginx installed and so on. Now, that has a folder system. So basically what we're doing here is we're just defining where we're going to store in that container, on that operating system, on our server, where we're going to store the cache. So that's where we're going to store it. Now you can change that, of course you can. It's not mandatory to store it there, but that's where we're going to set that up. And that just kind of follows some of the other guides that you might be looking at. Among the range of different parameters that we can define here, there is a few mandatory. So there's a mandatory keys zone. So we need to define keys zone. And that is a parameter that was going to define the name and also the size of the shared memory zone that is used to actually store the metadata about the cached items. Now it's worth noting here that, like I said, there's a variety of different options here. We can split cache across multiple hard drives. Of course we can. In addition to that, we can also use other tools to actually store cache. Here, like I said, we're just going to be utilizing the default disk setup. But that is definitely an option. So something else that normally gets asked is, here we're going to define the name and the amount. And that amount is a quantity that can be defined in many different ways. So that leads us nicely into the Nginx documentation. If you haven't already found that, go ahead, just type in Nginx documentation and you'll find the Nginx documentation. Now, generally, I would say that the Nginx documentation, although it's well written, it can be a little bit too technical and not give you enough information to help you get started utilizing some of the different tools. But I think over time, you'll get used to of course you will. You'll get used to utilizing Nginx and trying to translate how some of the information can then be applied within your configurations. But anyway, I was talking about measurement units. So you can clearly see here the measurement units that you can set in your configuration files. So let's give this a name, Nginx Cache. Call it whatever you like, and then we can define the amount. So let's just go for 20 M. So M in this case, we can see it specifies megabytes. So here we can use the lowercase or uppercase M, and then in addition, we also have kilobytes if you want to define in kilobytes with the lower or uppercase K. So now we have the location of our cache, we have a name for our cache, and then also we've specified, like we said previously, the parameter which defines the size of the shared memory zone that is used to store, which I said, metadata about the cached items. Because essentially what we have here behind the scenes is that the cached responses are stored. The actual, for example, data about the web page, the HTML, etc. This is all stored with a copy of this metadata in the specified file system here that we've described. Now, that doesn't limit the amount of data that we can store. So to limit the amount of cache response data, we also need to include the max size. So this will then describe the maximum amount of data that we want to store. So going back to our measurement units here, we can see that we can also specify in gigabytes using G or the G suffix. So let's go ahead and do exactly that. So let's just say that we want to have a couple of gig for this. So equals 10 gig. So don't forget, and I keep forgetting, that this essentially is one line. So whereas before we had the semicolon at the end of each statement, here, remember what I'm doing is I'm just dropping this down into these other rows here so that we can better define our parameters instead of making one long line. So we don't need the semicolon here after these parameters. We do that on the last parameter only. Okay, so cache isn't going to be saved forever. We potentially want to refresh. So let's go ahead and define, utilizing the inactive parameter here. We want to basically define how long we want to store that piece of data, that cache, in cache, before potentially we're going to refresh. So let's go for just, for example, 60 minutes. So when setting up cache, timing is really important. It's probably its own tutorial discussing time. So I'm not necessarily going to discuss the correct amount of times. We're just going to go for the basic setup here, and then that's something we can talk about at a later point. So this is another area of discussion which can be had at a later point, but actually storing cached data, we want to store it in a way which makes it very easy to find to improve performance, for example. And there's many different techniques we can utilize to do that. And we have here levels, which you'll see in other examples. Levels allows us, or as a parameter that provides a way of us defining how the file structure should be created. Just to clarify inactive here. So if, for example, we made a request, then an item was stored in cache. If that item in cache is inactive, not used within 60 minutes, then it will just get deleted. So it won't get refreshed, it will just get deleted. Okay, so now we have a basic configuration. So one thing to mention here is that we've set the max size. So what happens, or what manages that max size? So behind the scenes here, Nginx has a few different processes which manages cache. One of them is the cache manager. So basically what happens here is that periodically we can set the configuration of this. The cache manager will check the limit to check to see if the data that we're currently storing is more than the max size that we defined. If it does find that, basically the cache manager would just remove all the data that was accessed least recently. So all the oldest data will get deleted first. So now we have our cache folder set up. Let's go ahead and finish our configuration so we can apply it to our existing code here. So just a quick reminder, we are using a proxy, a reverse proxy here. So we're passing data from our Nginx server over to Unicorn, which is then being served by our Django instance. So that's currently what we have. We've set up our cache area, our cache folder. So let's go ahead now and tell Nginx that we want to now start caching data from our Django server. So let's now make a reference to our cache key right here. So we're going to say proxy and then cache, and then we need to then make a reference to our cache zone. And that's pretty much it. That is kind of a basic setup. So we want to check to see if this is actually working. So we can send some data back to the client by adding some items here into the header. So let's just add header. Now, if you don't know what the header is, it'd be well worth doing a little bit of reading. I don't want to explain it here, but essentially, when we send data across to the server and back, there's a number of different metadata that we're sending across, and that gives the server a way of being able to manage that request. So that data can be stored, that metadata information can be stored in the header. So we can pass data back and forth in the header of the request that we make to the server. So let's go ahead and we're going to return X proxy cache, and that should be a capital. So we're going to send a message back to the browser, which we're going to view shortly. And we're basically just going to describe whether the cache is working or not. So let me just see if I can find the $sign. So we're going to say upstream cache status. So that's going to tell us basically whether we are using cache or not. And that gives us a good indication whether our configuration is working. So let's get this started and see if this actually works. So we're going to go for a semicolon there. Then we go ahead now and we just need to Docker compose. Now this is where you're going to need Docker obviously installed. Docker compose up. That's going to basically build the images and then run the containers. While that's doing that, just to remind you, I am using the Docker extension here. So go ahead and type in Docker, download this extension, and then we have the Docker icon here. And from here, I can manage then all the different instances, so the containers and the images. So I can see that these are the images I've just made, and these are the containers that have just been built. And you can see that everything is running nicely. So I should now be able to access that. So I'm just going to open up Chrome for this, because no doubt you're probably using Chrome. So let's just go ahead and we're going to use the loopback address for this. So everything is working okay. So I'm not going to be utilizing the domain here, just so I don't have to configure the DNS on my machine, but everything is working from the loopback address, so that's all good. So let's go ahead and have a look to see if the DNS is working. Sorry, the cache is working. So here you can press F12. That's going to bring up this nice little interface here. So if I refresh the page, go into the top option here, down here we have the X proxy cache. So you can see here it says miss. So there's three different options here that is going to be returned. Actually, you can't see that. Apologies. Let me bring that up. It says miss here, X proxy cache. So here I'm in network. I've clicked on what represents the page, and we've got the response headers. Response headers. Remember, we're passing something back in the headers. That was the X proxy cache information. It says miss. So essentially, we're saying with a miss that the cache isn't being utilized. If it's hit, then it means we are using cache. And then potentially you're also going to see a third option, which is bypassed. And we'll see that in this, or maybe this or next tutorial. Bypass essentially means we can bypass different things. And it's hard to describe that, but we'll discuss that in the next tutorial. There we go. So miss. So we're not currently using it. So let's just refresh. We'll go back and you can still see that we have X proxy cache miss. So it doesn't look like at the moment, if I keep refreshing, that we're utilizing cache. So potentially there's an error. So this error just gives us a little kind of segue into just quickly building up our Django application. So we have a few different pages so that we can better simulate our requests. So inside of Django, I'm going to go over to the demo here in URLs, and you'll find this in the code, so you don't have to potentially copy this in. But I'm just basically going to add two new paths. So if you're new to Django, don't worry, this is kind of irrelevant, but I'm just adding two new URLs so we can access two new pages that we're going to build. And then from the Django views generic, I'm just going to bring in the template view. So I've just set up two new paths there if you're new to Django, and I've brought in the resource that we can use the template view. Right, so with that in place, let's just go ahead and build a new folder. I'm going to call that templates. So inside of here, I'm going to build two new templates. I'm just going to drag them in. I've already made them. So you can right click and add new file, but I've called the file p1.html and p2.html. And in addition to that, I've then gone ahead and just created some code. And what I've got here is just the bootstrap template. And then in addition to that, in the middle, I've got a little kind of statement here, which is checking to see if the user is authenticated or not. Okay, so just check out the tutorial link to the GitHub repository, copy and paste that in. I'll just zoom out slightly so you can see its entirety. If you wanted to kind of copy that, it looks a little bit like that. Like I said, this template is just the bootstrap template. So if you just type in bootstrap, go to the introduction guide, copy and paste that. And then this is just a little bit of code we put in there. Okay, so copy that in. So now we have two files. You can see that the second page here doesn't have that. So I'll just add that in. There we go. So we've got our two web pages. So in addition to that, I just need to go over to the settings here, and I just need to define the path for that. So the template directory, just to tell Django that we're utilizing that template directory. There we go. So the containers are now stopped. Let's go ahead and we're just going to go for a compose build again. So we'll just rebuild everything and bring that up. Hopefully that will get updated. Everything looks okay. So just go back into our page here and just type in /p1, and that takes us to our new page. So let's just go in. Remember, I pressed F12 to get into this console here, network, and I'm just going to go to this page here and just take a quick look. I can bring this back up. It's P1 in headers. Let's have a look. So you can see here we've got X proxy cache miss still. So if I refresh a few times, you can still see that we're missing. So potentially we're still not using cache. So I'll be honest with you, I've never run such a minimal configuration, but I was expecting Nginx by default, like it says in the manual, to cache all responses to requests made with HTTP GET and head. And I assumed that was actually the default behavior. So that's fairly new for me. Now, the reason why that could be is because I do work with Nginx Plus, and that could be the default behavior just for Nginx Plus. Now, it's worth noting at this point, there are two versions of Nginx. Nginx provides an open source package. That's exactly what we're using in these tutorials. But in addition to that, you can also subscribe to Nginx Plus. It's fairly pricey for an individual, but it does offer some more advanced features. So I'll leave a link in the video description where you can go ahead and have a look at some of these different features on both of the packages. So let's go ahead and just fine tune some of or just view some of the different options we have to fine tune what to cache. So one of the settings that we have to specify which requests to cache is we can specify to cache responses based upon what type of request has been sent. So a GET, maybe a POST request. If you're not familiar with this, it's well worth just having a look. If you type into Google HTTP requests, have a look at GET and POST, what that means. So let's go ahead and type in proxy, I think it's proxy cache methods. So here, for example, we can specify get requests will be cached. So in addition to that, we can also limit, or in actual fact, disable caching completely. And remember, we're working within a location, so we are specifying the cache based upon this particular location here. So let's go for proxy cache valid. So what we can do here is specify how long cache responses with specified or specific status codes are considered valid. So going back here, we have a status code. Here we have a 200 status code right here. So that's returned from the server. A 200 status code just tells us that the web page is absolutely fine, the response is fine. Have a look again at HTTP responses if you're not familiar with those. But essentially, we can apply caching based upon the status. So it might be that you only want to cache pages that actually work. So we know that if we return a 200, that means that the page is working okay. And then we can go ahead and just basically specify in minutes, for example, how long the cache responses will be considered valid. So let's just go for example, 10 minutes. So it might be that you want to apply a number of these. You can chain these within this list here, or potentially you can add new lines. So for example, a 404 response, we'll set that to 5 minutes. Okay, so with that in place, let's just start fresh. So I'm just going to close everything down, Control and C. I'm just going to close everything down. You can see all my containers are now spanned down. So let's go ahead and we'll just delete that. And just for the sake of it, so we're all working on the same page, we'll just go ahead and remove any of the images. Here I'm just doing it manually. I realize that we can use commands to do this. So we're completely fresh Docker setup, no images, no containers. And let's then just go for another reload. So we'll use Docker Compose up, that will build the images and then bring up the containers. That'll take a few seconds. So of course, by doing that, by removing the container, there is no cache stored in that container anymore. So we are working completely fresh here. So that's going to take a few moments to come up. And there we go. So it looks like we've got an error here in our Nginx configuration. So you notice that I didn't use the semicolon. So if you do have a square, if you go back to our Docker container, so if you find that your Nginx server doesn't come up, I can click on it. It should provide me a little bit more information if you're not familiar with utilizing Docker. However, in this case, it's really quite simple. I haven't included the semicolons at the end here. So we'll go ahead and do that. Now what I can do is now just start. It will then load that configuration. You can see now that the Nginx container is now working. So let's give this a go. Let's go to our home page first. Okay, so we've got the 404 not found. Okay, so let's go for P1. So that's on the first load here. So we receive a proxy cache miss. So let's just reload this page and hopefully this time you can now see we get the proxy cache hit. So we're now working from cache. So the hit is referring to the fact that the page has now been cached on our Nginx container where we've specified the folder, and now we're returning the information, the request, from the user via the proxy cache. So let's see if this works on the second page. So the first page here, we can see that we've got a miss. So we don't return, we don't load from cache, and then we refresh again. And hopefully this time you can now see we have the proxy cache hit. So it does indicate now that our cache is working properly and we are now returning pages via the cache. So just remember that we don't necessarily have to specify our cache within the location. It can be placed within the server or the outer HTML element. So we can place it here, for example, and obviously we may have multiple locations. So therefore we can utilize that one cache for multiple locations, any of the parameters that we set. So let's go for this. Let's go ahead and we'll set our proxy cache as such here. And then what we do is we'll create a new location. We'll have a location for for our page 1. So we're set up a completely separate cache setup for our page 1 here. So let's go ahead. We'll just copy the configuration from location. There we go. Okay, so we're just passing over to demo again. Remember, we have set this up as a reverse proxy. If you want to have a look at that setup, then have a look at the previous tutorials. So we're just sending across some headers. So we are using method get. We are going to cache, but this time we're not. Okay, so this time we don't want to cache. So there's essentially a few ways to prevent cache here. Maybe we've already cached the page and we want to just kind of override it, so we can potentially use cache bypass. And bypass is something that I would use in the next tutorial. And you can see that we can start to specify. Now, what we need to remember here is all this data metadata is being passed back and forward. So we can really kind of fine tune what to actually cache based upon some of these different settings and what's being returned from the server. And there's quite a lot of power here in what we can do. And although we won't go into that detail in this tutorial, it's well worth noting and becoming a little bit more familiar with some of these settings if you aren't already. So what we're going to do is just say proxy cache bypass, and then we can use the $HTTP cache bypass setting. So essentially we're just trying to bypass the cache at this point. We can just say proxy cache off, for example. Another way just to kind of turn off the proxy, the cache there. So let's give that a go. So we're going to need to just go into here, attach the shell, and let's just reload Nginx so it then rereads the configuration and utilizes our updated configuration. So Nginx, and then use the S flag and reload. So what we've done now then is we've created this new setup so that we're not storing cache for this URL here. So hopefully now, when we go back into page 1, let's just give it a refresh. Let's go back into P1, and you can see here actually the X-Range option is deny, and that's obviously they're not now utilizing the cache. So we've essentially turned off cache for this page only. So if we go back to our page 2 here, you can still see we are receiving this information from cache. We are still getting a hit here. So it's not always desirable to set up cache when you've got pages that aren't visited very often. So what you might want to do, and what the setting that is available, is that we can define how many times a page is viewed before it is cached. So we can use proxy cache min uses. And here we just specify an arbitrary number, say 5, 10, 20, or whatever. So basically we're setting a number that defines how many times the page will be visited before it then enters cache. So here I've defined 5. So let's go ahead and just back in my shell for the Nginx. So I'm inside the container. I'm going to reload that. See if we can give this a go. Now, what's probably better here is that we just reset everything. So let me just take you through a process of how to delete the cache. So although I'm going to show you a very manual way of deleting the cache, if you are utilizing Nginx Plus, then you can use the proxy cache purge and basically send a request via the URL to actually delete the cache. But on the free version, I don't think that is available. So again, I'm utilizing the Docker extension here just to make things nice and easy, so I'm not switching in between. So I'll go over here and you can see my containers. So we can actually view the cache. Remember, it's in the files and then var cache Nginx. So var, inside of here we've got cache and then Nginx. So this is where our cache is being stored. So all we need to do essentially is just delete this file, or this folder, sorry. So to do that, we can do that from the command prompt. So again, I am in a shell, just to confirm. So I've right-clicked and I've opened it attached to shell. So that gives me access to the container to write commands directly in the container. So let's just go for an RM and then an RF, and then just say var cache and then Nginx. So that's basically just going to remove the folder. then Nginx will automatically recreate that folder for us when it initiates the cache. So let's just now go for a reload. Okay, so we shouldn't have any cache now. So just to double check, if I refresh this page, we get a miss. So that's P2. Just to double check our configuration. So it's P1 that doesn't have any cache. So P2 should have cache. Now, notice that the first time again, we get a miss. Okay, so second time I reload this page, notice actually, in fact, I'm now getting a hit. So I wasn't expecting that. So what should happen here? Let's just check our configuration. What should happen here, most definitely, is that we should wait 5 times. So we should reload the page 5 times before we then actually have a hit. Now, the likely resolve to this is we just need to move the configuration more locally. So if we move the proxy cache, Nginx Cache, into the location, and then we need to just do, no, that's fine. So we move that into location block here, and let's just give that a go again. So we remove the cache, we go ahead and have a reload again. So I just refresh this page, it's P2. So we definitely got a miss on the first instance, and then we are now getting a hit on the second instance. So it doesn't seem to be taking this configuration for some reason. So let's just take a quick look. I do apologize. Sometimes you can get different messages because of all the different kind of browser cache and just ensuring everything is reloaded properly and so on. So what I've done, I've just restarted the containers. I remade the containers using Docker Compose up after I removed everything. I've moved up the proxy cache nearer to the Nginx cache here, just to make a little bit more sense. So we want to load our cache, or we've identified where we want to store the cache, sorry, and then we've defined the fact that we want to make sure that the page must be loaded at a minimum 5 times before we then store it in the cache. And then we're just going to check to make sure it's a GET request. We're going to store those, and then we've defined how long we're going to store them for based upon the different HTTP status codes. Right, so with that in place, well, let's just go ahead, and at the moment this is missing, so we've got a miss here. You can just about see that if I bring that in. So I've refreshed twice so far. This is, I think, the 3rd time, and then refreshed the 4th time. I think that was the 4th time, maybe the 5th time, and then eventually we then get to a hit. So it is now working correctly. So we've specified the page must be loaded 5 times before we then store it in cache. So again, like I said, it's not always ideal to store every page in cache if it's only being used once every so often. So we can then obviously now specify the minimum use before we then store it into the cache. So I do hope that was a basic introduction into Nginx Cache, and you can start to see how potentially you might want to start utilizing this, or how to, configure this for your application. So there's a few things that I didn't mention. For example, I didn't quite go into cache locking here. The tutorial was getting quite long, and there are some very specific cases potentially for this. So that can be another tutorial. And in addition to that, I didn't mention the second process I started to I mentioned, at the start of the tutorial. So the first process involved in caching was the cache manager, which I mentioned performs a range of different tasks, one of them being removing data that exceeds the max size parameter. So the second one was the cache loader, and this runs once right after Nginx starts. And this is really about kind of loading metadata about previously cached data into the shared memory zone. And that's something that we can talk about again at a later tutorial. So again, hopefully that was a good grounding. At this point, almost it's just a case of drilling down into the documentation, having a look at some of the core modules, and that would then lead you into features that are available for your cache setup. Again, thank you very much for watching if you've got to the end, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial.